Andrew Urquhart with you on the program today. And whilst it is all very Christmassy and festive and all those sorts of things, this time last week, we couldn't have imagined what would have unfolded over the weekend with the sudden collapse of the Assad regime in Syria after so many years. 13 years, I think, of civil war or thereabouts. My maths is a bit dodgy, but it seems like this was the civil war that would never end. And then quite suddenly it has come to an end. There are new people in power in Syria, although the details are a little bit murky on that. Of course, the ruler, the dynastic rule of the Assad family has come to an end. And, the current ruler, of course, fleeing to Moscow, with some analysis on what has happened and why, and potentially what may happen next. Professor Robert Patman from Otago University. Kia ora, good morning. Thanks for your time today.
Kia ora, Andrew. Good morning.
This is a very complicated situation which has unfolded over many years. Quite a sudden and dramatic end to the war in Syria, Robert.
Yes, and it shows you how interlinked the conflicts are within the Middle East, because I think one of the crucial factors that precipitated the sudden collapse of the Assad regime was the fact that two key allies, Iran, which had been weakened, in particular its proxy Hezbollah had been weakened, and an ally called Hamas had been weakened. Mm-hmm. So Iran's military capabilities had been degraded by association, at least. And in addition, Russia had found itself, since it helped Syria get the upper hand in the civil war, which was around about 2016. Yeah. Since then, of course, but 6 years later, it got involved in what has turned out to be a catastrophic ensnarement in Ukraine, which is draining Russia. So Russia and Iran, when President Assad appealed to them about 10 days ago or so for help, they were only able to offer limited assistance. Yeah. One thing I think our viewers and listeners should take into account is that Assad came very close, the regime came very close to collapsing in 2011. Mm-hmm. And it was then intervention by Iran and Russia that saved the day for the Assad dictatorship, and also the unwillingness of the then Obama administration, which was still very mindful of the lessons of Iraq. Yeah. The Bush administration got involved in Iraq, and that didn't go well. The Obama administration didn't really want to get involved in another Middle Eastern war. So for those reasons, we've seen basically the Assad regime fall. What is the interesting thing here is there seems to be other actors involved. Mm-hmm. Turkey is one. Yeah. And it's also possible Ukraine's played a role. What about the rebels who did the work? Yeah. A group called HTS is perhaps the easiest acronym, but they seem to be the leading group. But what is interesting, Andrew, is that it was a coalition of groups, including those that are pro-Western, mm-hmm. and some groups which may be described as Islamist, or even previous links with Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. They broadly came together in opposition to Assad. They began training, apparently, for this type of event about 7 months ago. Mm-hmm. And I guess really they were. All the indications are that the rebels were actually surprised by how quickly the Assad regime folded. The big step forward was the victory at Aleppo. Yeah. And many people expected the Assad regime, to rally and hold Damascus, but the momentum was with the rebels, and they moved swiftly. And it seems like they had crucial support from both Turkey and perhaps drone assistance from Ukraine. Why would Ukraine be involved? Well, it'd like to see Mr. Putin's position weakened in Syria.
Of course, there were hundreds of Russians killed in Syria as the regime fell, although that's just a morning's work for the Ukrainian army at the moment. We'll talk more about that
Sure.
a little bit later on. But just wanting to talk about this unlikely coalition in some ways. This is part of the reason why the civil war in Syria has taken so long. There's so many factions, there's so many groups that hate each other as much as they hate the Assad regime. And this divide and conquer, I suppose, has been what has kept this civil war going so long. What do you think the incentive was for these groups to finally be able to work together?
I think there is a powerful incentive, and that is that the Assad dictatorship, one of the reasons it fell and it was unable to retain the loyalty of its own army was because of the miserable life that even supporters of the regime have experienced.
Yeah.
The economy has been stagnant. And although Assad and his inner circle lived in tremendous luxury, for many people who were, if you like, supporters of the regime but not close to it, the living standards were poor. So I think the incentive is, and we've seen some promising signs. HTS, a chap called Abu Mohammed al-Jalani seems to be the strategist, the person who masterminded this overthrow. He has past links with al-Qaeda, but has disowned that.
Yep.
And has shown signs of moderation. For one thing, I think many international observers have been impressed by the fact that the rebels have basically released all political prisoners. They've also committed themselves towards moving towards a more open market economy.
Yep.
And also, they've said that public servants that work for the Assad regime won't be penalized unless they were directly involved in the repression, such as in prison camps and torture cells. They will be facing justice. But I think there's some promising signs there that they do want to have a better economy, living standards for all Syrians. And I think the HTS leader said that they wanted to reconcile with groups that have been divided from each other by the Assad dictatorship.
I mean, this is reasons for celebration, of course, just before for Christmas and celebration in the streets in many parts of Syria. Having said that, though, a little bit of déjà vu on this one, and comparisons have been made to the fall of Iraq and Saddam Hussein, who, of course, was also a strong man and a dictator. And yet when his regime fell, Iraq has just sort of splintered into a range of different groups from which it has never recovered. There are some people that are perhaps concerned. Now, of course, it's a different country, but are there parallels here that there was a strong man in control that kept everything together and there was some type of enforced unity, whereas Syria without that strongman leadership will just splinter into groups and divisions and perhaps a similar situation to what Iraq finds itself in today?
It's possible that will happen, without the common denominator of opposition to Assad.
Yep.
No longer there. There's the possibility for resumed internal conflict. But I think a couple of things. Firstly, the Iraq parallel's been drawn by many people, and it's a fair point to make. But the problem was, for many Iraqis, much as they hated Saddam Hussein, and many did, they resented the fact the United States illegally invaded their country and removed the regime for him.
Yeah.
So I think that was a foreign factor which upset a lot of Iraqis. This has been done by Syrians with external support, which is slightly different. And I also think that many Syrians, they've got a large number of Syrians abroad who have been relatively well educated, who may well return over time. Yeah. So I think there's a feeling that they're trying to learn from others' experience. And, I think there's a fighting chance that HTS, if it continues its moderate line, will get support from the international community. I think that's crucial. I don't think we should rush to judgment about the new regime. They should be given a chance to walk the talk. They've said they're committed to a democratic transition. give them a chance and incentivize it by setting up milestones such as democratic elections, etc. Most Syrians have suffered enormously.
Yeah.
And I think it's incumbent on the rest of the world, if they have a moderate leadership, at least committed in principle to democracy, then we shouldn't prejudge them before they've had a chance to reach for that goal. And I think that's very important.
You mentioned, and let's talk about some of the other international players involved in this one. You mentioned the significant difference of US troops not involved in this one, but obviously NATO involvement at some level, particularly with Turkey, of course, as a NATO member, possibly some significant support from Turkey. Of course, the slightly awkward situation that the US have supported the Kurdish rebels on this one. So it is a complicated geopolitical situation. But yes, Turkey directly involved, but do you think that there was perhaps more broader NATO support for what has happened in Syria?
It's difficult to be absolutely clear. Turkey has emerged as an important geopolitical player. Shortly before Turkey, if you like, gave the green light to the rebels doing what they did, and we're talking mainly about HTS here.
Yeah.
Before they did that, Mr. Erdogan, the Turkish leader, was quite clear that he would not accept a Trump-Putin deal in Ukraine that failed to preserve the territorial, or restore, I should say, the territorial integrity of Ukraine before it was invaded by Russia.
Wow.
Very interesting statement.
Yeah.
He just said that we will not accept that. So he will not accept a land for peace deal in Ukraine. That was followed up with, now looks in retrospect, decisive Turkish role. I think Turkey was motivated by what they see as the threat of the Kurds.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure Turkey was completely dedicated to overthrowing Assad per se. I think that was perhaps a bonus. But I think their major concern was to support those forces that were rivaling the Kurds.
You mentioned before Ukrainian involvement as well. The enemy of my enemy is my friend in this regard. You'd think that Ukraine would be busy enough with literally getting bogged down in a very broad front line on the cusp of what may be a peace deal, but definite signs of Ukrainian drones or Ukrainian drone training involved in this.
Yes. No, I think there's little doubt that the Ukrainians were involved. And by the way, I do think the Ukrainians did see it as linked to their future relationship with Moscow, because this is a major defeat for Mr. Putin.
Yeah.
And from Ukrainians' point of view, that weakens him going forward into any negotiations. The Kursk incursion that we've spoken about before was designed also for the possibility of negotiations. And the other thing is, the Ukrainians have good intelligence about rivalries within Putin's entourage. The thing about authoritarian regimes, Andrew, is you never know in advance when they're going to fall and who's going to challenge them. Yeah, we found that out when we spoke about Yevgeny Prigozhin, when we spoke about a year ago about that coup attempt. There could be someone waiting in the wings to do a better job than the boss in the Kremlin. Yeah. And they've now got something to argue against Mr. Putin over within the Kremlin. That is to say, a lot of Russian lives have been lost in Syria. A lot of equipment's been lost. A lot of money has invested in Syria going over a decade. And what is the outcome? They couldn't defend, or they were unwilling to support, when push came to the shove, the Assad regime. And the Assad regime, of course, is Mr. President Assad and his family have been in Moscow for some time.
Well, hey, interesting situation indeed, and good to have some optimism, some hope for the people of Syria. A lot remains to be seen, and it is, as I say, a very complex geopolitical situation, but perhaps some reasons to celebrate for the people of Syria. Robert, thank you for all that you've brought to our program over this year. We certainly appreciate it. Merry Christmas to you and yours. Thanks for joining us once again.
Merry Christmas to you and yours. All the best, and all the best to our listeners.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the Rhema studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.